So first of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my research here. My research focused on a critical analysis of the feminization of migration, and my paper was written under the guidance of Dr. Sarada Mohi Chatterjee from Cambridge University. So a little bit of background on the feminization of migration and why it's important to assess the extent to which it has taken place. Firstly, women account for 47.9% of the total international migrant population, and that's clearly a significant proportion. And if we don't understand the nuances of women in migration and the issues faced by them, or the state of these women, it'll be difficult to make policy changes that can actually help them and in turn help the economy and help the development of countries. Secondly, Stephen Castles and Mark J. Miller, in their book, The Age of Migration, identify the feminization of international migration as a general migratory trend that would play a major role in the first 20 years of the 21st century. And I think there couldn't be better timing of me writing this paper because I think I was able to get a really good retrospective view not too long after the first 20 years. And that has allowed me to make some suggestions that I think are extremely relevant at this point in time. And thirdly, comprehending the gender dynamic within migration is also essential for analyzing the advantageousness, the evolution, and the nuances of migration, especially since women account for such a large proportion of migratory streams. And so essentially the objective of my research was to understand whether the various facets of the feminization of migration have been achieved or not, and to the extent that they've been achieved in the regions that they've been achieved. The method that my paper followed was it examined different definitions of feminization and analyzed trends in each such facet to explore the extent to which the feminization of migration has taken place. And so, because individual sets of research usually focus on only one definition of the feminization of migration, I wanted my research to focus on all definitions to get a more holistic understanding and reach a more reasoned conclusion on the extent to which the feminization has taken place. And so conclusions from each definition were integrated in my research. I use secondary data and statistics as the foundation for my analysis, and sources of secondary data included World Bank, United Nations International Migration Reports, World Economic Forum reports, and studies such as international migration and gender in Latin America, a comparative analysis. The different definitions of feminization and migration that my paper explored were: first, feminization in terms of an increase in the share of women in migration streams. Second, feminization vis-a-vis an increase in the opportunities for women to migrate. Thirdly, feminization as a shift in the reasons for migration from familial and marital to economic and opportunity-centric. And lastly, feminization as the achievement of a decent state of living, or at least a state of living parallel to what their male counterparts have achieved. The first definition of feminization that my paper looked at is feminization in terms of an increase in the share of women. And by this, I don't mean an increase in the number of women migrating. I mean an increase in the proportion of women migrating as opposed to other genders. So women, as I explained, account for 47.9% of the total international migration population, as for data from 2019. But in 1960, the percentage of women migrants relative to men was 46.6%. So as you can see, the number of women migrants from 1960 to 2000 may have increased largely, but the ratio of women in comparison with men still remains largely similar. Between 1960 and the 2000s, and that's 40 years. And despite the fourth wave of feminism, the ratio of women migrants has not seen a substantial increase even post the 2000s. Regional trends in gender composition of migrants. So in most regions, there's been an increase in the percentage of female migrants from 1990 to 2017. But this increase in the female migrant ratio was not substantial. And this paper defines substantial as any increase that is south of 5%. So for instance, in South Asia, the increase of the proportion of female migrants was from 46.7% to 48.3%. In Europe and Central Asia, it was from 52% to 52.4%. And even in regions where So in regions where this increase took place, we may not even be able to attribute this increase to a greater inflow of female migrants, but it may just be because of greater female life expectancy compared to men. And this is actually a more plausible explanation considering how small the increase has been. But in regions where there was a drop in the percentage, the drop was actually substantial. For instance, in East Asia and the Pacific, the percentage decreased from 48.6% to 41.7%, sorry, which is a substantial drop. As you can see in the graph here, it shows the varying gender compositions in with time for international migration by region. And you can see that wherever there has been an increase, the increase is either slightly more than what the value was in 1990, or it's level with the value that it was at in 1990. But the drop that I think is really jarring is, as I explained, in East Asia and the Pacific, the drop is definitely more substantial than the other increases that we see. Coming to a demographic analysis of gender composition, the number of women in the working age migrant population has increased from the year 2000 onwards in only 24 out of 63 countries for which data is available. And interestingly, the working age migrant population share of women in upper middle income countries, where the fourth wave of feminism was definitely more prevalent and more widespread, considering it was the means of the movement was the internet. It was definitely more prevalent in these countries, but in these countries, the share of working age migrant women fell from 49.1% to 43.2%. And the percentage of women from middle income countries also reduced from 48.5% to 45.6%. And in low income countries, the percentage actually saw a slight increase, but again, it's not a substantial increase. It was only an increase by 1% from 49.2% to 50.2%. So in the economic sphere as well, there was no ubiquitous, uniform evidence of the feminization of migration as defined by an increase in the proportion of women. The second definition of feminization of migration that we will discuss is the increase in migratory opportunities. So on a global scale, prospects of migration have bettered because of an increase in female literacy. So the adult female literacy rate in, say, 1990 was 67.47%, but that became 83.024% in 2019. And this makes an increase in literacy. It makes women less reliant on others for migration documentation and procedural understandings. And so you'd assume that this counts as feminization because women are now more freely and more capable of making decisions and actually executing those decisions on their own. And modern norms as well have increased the socially acceptable minimum age for marriage, again allowing for women to migrate more freely. And again, with the fourth wave of feminism, societies have become less patriarchal, at least to some small minimalist extent. And a study of 5 Latin American countries shows how the more patriarchal a society is, the less women migrate out of it. And so the fourth wave of feminism has definitely made societies less patriarchal and allowed for women to migrate more than they could before. But despite improving opportunities, there are still many challenges that women face in migratory streams. For instance, the gender pay gap was at 19% globally in 2018, which means that women had fewer resources and continue to have fewer resources to migrate. And this is especially important for women because studies show that migration actually uses a larger proportion of the income and savings of women vis-a-vis men. In 32 countries, women are not allowed to apply for a passport the same way married men can. And in 30 countries, women are not allowed to choose where they want to live. So again, there are several factors that still hinder a woman's ability to migrate of her own volition. Women are also often primary undertakers of household responsibilities because of the gender division of household labor. And this makes it difficult for them to leave their families behind. Studies show how a mother's migration requires a change in the childcare responsibilities of households, which could be detrimental for a child's development. And this often has a psychological impact on the mother and the child, thus deterring migration. The third definition that we look at is understanding the reasons for migration. So if women are migrating for reasons independent of their spouses and families, and they're migrating for reasons such as their own economic gain or their own opportunities in the workforce, we can say that that is, to a large extent, the actualization of the feminization of migration. And that has taken place in part. So there's growing demand for low-skilled services in aging and developing economies, and growing unemployment. They've both encouraged women to migrate. And one instance of this is increasing migration from poor Asian countries to rich Asian countries, which we refer to as South-to-South migration, which is increased labor market participation of women migrants. But still, many women migrate for marital and familial purposes. In 2018 Eurostat data from 17 European Union countries shows how the number of females who migrate to the EU for familial reasons are twice as many as the number of males who do so. In India as well, 97% of the population that migrates internally for marriage is constituted of women. And of the women that migrate internally, 49% do so for marriage, and another 15% do so for familial reasons. And so even though women account for 66% of the internal migrants in India, it would be incorrect to categorize Indian migration as feminized, simply because of the reasons for which these women migrate. Now we look at the global gender gap versus the migrant gender gap. So in OECD countries, the migrant labor force participation rate was 65% for women, while it was 82% for men. And I think that disparity is quite surprising. But what's even more surprising is that this disparity, it's extremely prevalent in countries with good global gender gap index rankings as well, because you'd expect them to be, these countries are the pinnacle of gender equality in the world right now. So you'd expect them to at least have some form of equality for migrants. But even in these countries, for instance, Norway, which is ranked second best in the index, has a 5+% gap between the female and male migrant employment to population ratios. Finland and Sweden, Finland ranks third in the index and Sweden ranks fourth, and they both have over a 10% difference in female and male migrant percentages. As you can see here, this is the employment to population ratio for migrants in high income countries. And there's almost a 10% gap at least within in all the high income countries shown on this graph. Countries like Italy have a 20% or more gap between the employment to population ratio of female and male migrants. And I think these are some really jarring statistics. The fourth definition that this paper explored was feminization in terms of the state of migrant women. So feminization can also be defined as the achievement of a decent, or at least equal to their male counterparts, standard of living for the women that migrate. Between 2009 and 2019, the share of working age migrant women with advanced education rose in 25 out of 40 countries, which is an impressive statistic. But there is still a large gap between the number of employed male and female migrants, even in high-income countries, as I showed you in the previous slide. In countries like Ghana, Tanzania, and Mali, female migrant workers earn 80% less than their male counterparts. And in Chile, 34% of female migrants with an upper, a secondary, or a higher education work in elementary occupations. And this is extremely recent data. It's just as of 2018. And the same figure is only 22% for male migrants and 15% for non-migrant women. And there are some other key issues faced by migrant women that I think are important to address. Issues like xenophobia are exacerbated amongst female migrant populations due to their dependency and vulnerability, as we've already discussed. And this is especially in the case of informal migrants and undocumented workers. Those who work as domestic workers are generally not covered by employment laws and benefits in most countries, and so are prone to abuse. Being a part of income-based or forced sex work, again, adds to very obvious vulnerabilities. For instance, in France, data from 2003 shows how 69% of the HIV diagnoses were migrants, and 65% of these migrants were women. And so coming to the conclusions that my paper reached, the first conclusion was that there has been a feminization of the knowledge and the information on migration, because today we have a lot more gender-specific data on migration than we did, say, 40 years ago, and that is an improvement. But when we look at feminization of migration in terms of the definitions that most research papers discuss and the definitions that this paper has collated, you see that the feminization has really only been actualized in part in select regions and select criteria, as opposed to all regions and all facets. And I think that this is something that policymakers need to take into account when actually looking at migration legislation, because the lack of data on women so far has sort of inhibited these policymakers from making laws specific to women. But now that this data is available and we understand the issues that women face, and we understand the gap between women and men who migrate, there is a lot of scope for improvement in the policy sphere. Lastly, I want to thank Dr. Sarada Mohi Chatterjee, who helped me with this paper. And Kanika Mahajan and Isabel Green are teaching assistants. This is a complete list of sources for those interested, and I'd be happy to take any questions that anyone may have now.
Thank you so much. That was so insightful. I think if there's anyone who has any questions, this would be a great time to ask.
I've got some questions that some other commentators that could be today written down in advance. I hope that's okay. One of the questions was that you mentioned that the feminization of migration has not occurred despite the fourth wave of global feminism. They were a bit confused as to the connection between feminism and feminization of migration, as in, why would we think that migration would be feminized as a result of feminism?
I'm really sorry, but would it be possible for you to repeat the question closer to say a mic? Is there a mic somewhere there?
Yeah, is this better?
A little. Yeah.
How about this?
Yeah, much better.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll summarize. Basically, I've got some questions that were pre-written by other commentators who unfortunately couldn't be here today. They wanted to find out a bit more about why we would think that migration would be feminized as a result of feminism if we haven't seen a feminization of migration despite the fourth wave of global feminism.
Right. So the fourth wave of feminism, I think we need to separate feminization of migration and the fourth wave of feminism, or feminism in general, because I think the feminization of migration is more about women in migration being given equal opportunity, and it's essentially feminism, but within the migratory sphere. So we're not saying that feminization of migration needs to be achieved over and above feminism in general, but just as a subset of feminism, the feminization of migration, I think that women and men in migratory streams also, it's like the same idea of feminism, but within migration, because not only migrants in general are considered, they're quite vulnerable to political policy, and they're vulnerable to a lot of factors in both their host countries and the countries where they come from. And these are only exacerbated by the fact that within the migrant community, women are even more disadvantaged than men. So at least if we reach some form of equality within the migrant community, I think then we can take that forward to actually trying to get equality between migrants as a whole, a community as a whole, and citizens of a country, because there shouldn't be a discrepancy of that sort between, say, migrants, between migrants and between citizens. But once we can only achieve that equality, once we achieve some form of equality within migration, and only then can, once migrants have the same, say, rights, have at least the same opportunities as citizens of a country, from then on you can, that's when the fight for feminism really starts. So we haven't even reached the point within migration and within migratory streams to have that parallel to fighting for feminism. So it's like we're still 3-4 steps behind fighting for feminism when we talk about the feminization of migration.
Really interesting, thank you.
Thank you.
And a second question, is so one of the lessons from intersectionality is that various kinds of oppression can interlock to produce entirely new complexes of oppression that are greater than the sum of their parts. Do you see this occurring in the context of migration?
Absolutely. So when you look at if you look at the sort of the cycle of migration, you see how sort of one sort of set of oppression, it just cascades to another and another and another. And we see that especially in the case of women, as I've explored, you see how women just from the get-go itself, they're either not educated enough to be able to migrate if they want to migrate. And then even if they are educated enough, then they have problems because some countries inhibit their rights to migrate. They're not allowed to migrate without the consent of, say, their father or their husband. And then even if they have that consent, then they have to worry about their children because of the gendered division of responsibility in households and the detrimental effect that a woman leaving the household has on a child. So once they consider that, say if they want to move with their family, it's often in some countries women migrate through brokers who charge them extra, or they exploit them, they cheat them, which is another factor. And then when they come to the country as well, as you can see from the huge disparity between the employment ratios of male migrants and female migrants, once they come to the country as well, it's so much tougher for them to find employment. As we saw in the case of Chile, 34% of the women who've had an upper secondary education or a higher education, they're still working in elementary occupations. And that figure is almost double that of what resident women endure. And it's even, I think it's also double of what what male migrants endure. So that's another layer of oppression that comes once they've already fought all those battles to migrate to a country where they thought they would have more opportunity. And then as well, if they have to work as domestic workers, which is what a lot of women migrants do, even if they are well educated, but they aren't able to find jobs. So then they enter the informal sector where they become, say, domestic workers there as well, because they aren't protected by employment laws in most countries. They're exploited there as well. And then if they work in, say, if they're forced to find additional sources of income, that's another thing that it cascades into, where, say, if they have to join the income-based sex work industry, they're exposed to a host of new vulnerabilities. As I talked about in my presentation, there's HIV, and I think there's a lot of risk that comes that even research papers that I found my information from aren't able to highlight. And so, yeah, there's a whole cascade of oppression that I think from start to finish, from even just having the idea that I want to migrate as a woman, I think that itself just brings so many risks to mind. So yes, there definitely is this whole domino effect of oppression within migration streams, especially for women.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for a very informative presentation. Just one question from me.
Yeah. Sure.
How do you think it's getting changed over the years? I mean, I know we are a long way improving this, but how do you think it was back 20 years back, and how is it now? And is there any slight positive changes are we seeing along the years?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there have definitely been some positive changes. Like I said, the feminization of migration has taken place. It just hasn't been ubiquitous, and it's taken place regionally in some regions, in some strata of women. So for instance, I talked about how in aging economies, there's a need for workers, and there's a lot of underemployment there. So women are able to move to those countries. There's a lot of south to south migration happening where women are getting opportunities, especially in low income countries, which is, I think, definitely a positive, because women being employed in low income countries, it's definitely a positive, because the fourth wave of feminism has barely even reached these countries, and we still see that positive change. So there's definitely hope. Also, I think the share of working age migrant women has also increased in, I think, about 25 of the 63 countries for which data is available. And the education levels of women are also improving. Literacy is improving, especially within the migrant community. And I think these are all really positive changes, but I think there definitely needs to be some policy changes that need to be brought about for this sort of this change to be materialized, because women now have the education, they have the ability to migrate. You know, laws are changing to allow women to do things on their own without the permission of, say, their husband or their fathers. But the only way this can actually materialize into some benefit for these women is if there's policy that actually helps them be employed. Say even policy that may help domestic workers, say protect them from, you know, from underpayment or protect them from such problems. Even those small steps, I think, will have a large impact. But there definitely has been some positive change, and I think we're getting there. We're getting there slowly. We need to accelerate it a bit, but we're getting there.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you.